Right. Of course, this particular PowerPoint is available for you to look at separately. So if you have trouble seeing some of the pages, you can look at it on your own. This is the 20th Century American Literature Week 3. We're looking at the 1940s and the 1950s. So it's World War II and its aftermath. The Second World War and its aftermath. So America entered World War II in 1942 after the Japanese attacked on Pearl Harbor. After World War One, America was really very reluctant to enter another international conflict. So even though they saw what was happening in Europe with the rise of Hitler and the takeover and his takeover of much of Europe, Roosevelt really couldn't get approval from Congress to join the conflict. There were too many people that believed America needed to keep out of it, that it wasn't our problem. However, on December 7th, 1942, Japan attacked America and bombed Pearl Harbor. Well, that changed everything. We immediately declared war on Japan and soon Germany, who was Japan's ally. World War II ended up being fought on two fronts, with the Atlantic uh, um, focusing on Germany, and then the Pacific, which focused on Japan. In Germany, of course, the war ended with the discovery of the concentration or death camps. And that was a pretty startling discovery for most of America. On the Pacific front, the war had an even more explosive ending, with America dropping the first atomic weapon on Japanese soil. This ushered not only the end of the conflict, but it also ushered a new age, the nuclear age. And with it a new terror which manifests itself in everything from the space race, the Cold War, to Godzilla movies. The literature of the time reflected this roller coaster ride that permanently affected the psyche of American society. Our first short story is Eudora Whatley's piece, um, the sorry, I'm having a moment. Um, the whole world knows. And you know, she was a master storyteller. She wrote quite a number of short stories. Received a great amount of accolades for her work. Um, in particular, she wrote a lot of pieces against the social climate of fear, hatred, and terror in Mississippi. This was some of her later work in the 1960s. Although most of her time between 1955 and 1966 was devoted to ailing family members, she managed to write two stories during those years, both reflecting the turbulent era and implicitly calling for civil rights. And in fact, civil rights became a lot of her focus when she wrote, in particular, when she wrote The Demonstrators, which was a story about the murders of a black man and woman in the Mississippi Delta and the white community's response. In her biography of Whatley, Suzanne Mars, another literary critic, writes that the story depicts white racists unable to see beyond the negative stereotypes they impose upon African Americans. A young civil rights worker who engages in his own form of stereotyping, and a white doctor who thinks himself free of such deceptions, but who fails to recognize his own African American maid as he treats her for a stab wound. Mars notes that the story resonated with many readers, including civil rights activist Jesse Jackson, who wrote to the New Yorker that the story was so true and powerful, it made him weep. Now, and the whole world knows Whitley's revulsion over violence um, against African Americans. Sorry, that's another short story she wrote. Where is the voice coming from? Which was about the violence against African Americans, in particular, the death of civil rights leader Medgar Evers, which greatly affected her. Now, the story you read, The Whole World Knows, is definitely one of her most imaginative. And you can see that the story changes in experiments with narrative strategies and with multiple points of view within the story. Sometimes making the story difficult to read. There are moments where she um, there are moments where we're inside the narrator's head. And then there are other moments where other people are talking, or there, in particular, there's this one section when we start to see some of the stuff, at least in my edition, it's in italics, where the narrator imagining his family members talking to him. So, for example, he imagines his mother saying, "Son, you're walking in a dream." And there's another spot in italics where it's his father talking to him. I'm trying to see if I can find it. There's also moments where he's imagining dreamlike states. For example, he imagines killing a rival for one of the women, Lonnie? Was it Lonnie? Yeah, Lonnie Duncan. And he imagines shooting him. And again, it didn't happen. But he kind of goes through it in his head because of what's going on around him. There's also a section where he beats Lonnie Dugan up. Another part. I beat Lonnie Dugan till there was nothing to know there, and I certainly proved the male body. It has too special shape not to be hurt. And at the end of the paragraph, he goes, "Duncan, I declare, was dead." But in fact, Duncan was fine. That was all in his head. Then there's a great monologue that happens to him when he's contemplating these women having an affair with one of the women, and kind of as his conscience, the woman at the bank starts to basically tell him off. See if I can find it. And then we have the whole section on Mrs. O'Leary and Bella, who he seems to have this kind of affinity for, in which he relates to Bella. He kind of understands what Bella is going through, and he feels sorry for Bella. Oh, here it is. We start with Bella. He starts with Bella, and Bella misjudged Judge O'Leary's little dog, panted sorrowfully all the time. She was sick. I always went out into the yard and spoke to her. Poor Bella. How do you do, lady? Is it hot? Do they leave you alone? Kind of reflecting on how he feels people react to him. And then he has a moment in his head where he's thinking about his mother. Mother said, Where have you been, son? Not anywhere, Mother. I wish you wouldn't look so peaked. And you keep things away from me, son. I haven't been anywhere. Where would I go? If you came back with me, everything would be just like it was before. I know you won't eat at Mrs. Judge's table, not her biscuit. And then the bank opens and he gets this huge monologue from Miss Callie Hudson about his, dalliances with women, and warning him that he should be faithful to his wife and not go out with these other women. And then in the end, he's married to the one woman. Then he is having an affair with Jenny. And then at the end, he meets with Mary Nadine. Again, has this moment where he's imagining, or maybe he's actually doing, he's threatening to kill himself, puts the pistol in his mouth, pulls the trigger, but nothing happens. But is that what really is going on, or is that kind of a metaphor? Because the next part, we're definitely given the impression that he rapes Nadine. And we see this with the reflection that he talks about with the hand. He says, in a minute, she put her hand out again, differently, and I touched my shoulder. Then I met it hard with my face, the small, bony, freckled, I knew hand that I hated, I knew, and kissed it and bit it until my lips and tongue tasted salt tears and salt blood. That hand was not Jenny's. Then I lay back on the bed for a long time up against the rods. Nadine says, You're so stuck up. I lay there, and after a while my eyes began to close and I saw her again. She lay there plain as day by the side of me, quietly weeping for herself. The kind of soft, restful meditative sobs a child will venture after a long punishment. So I slept. How was I to know she would hurt herself like this? Now where's Jenny? So, and again, we're not quite sure what's going on, whether or not, I have one critic who gives you the idea that perhaps he raped Nadine, because we have that moment with Nadine still white in her petticoat. So you get the idea that Nadine was someone that was virginal. So it's a very unusual story, again, dealing with a lot of different sexual elements. So going on forward, in the whole world knows, she uses these narrative, she meaning Eudora Welty, uses these narrative devices to excellent effect. Sometimes just pretty straightforward third-person omniscient narration focused on Rand. But other times we're right in his head as he indulges in fantasies of an attacking the guy his wife had an affair with, Dugan. Other times, Wetley, our author, has one of the bank customers carry the story forward in a monologue addressed to Rand at the teller window. That's Callie. Where Rand addresses a father, we can easily surmise this is some form of confession, like a Catholic confession. Most of all, I think among all the stories up to this point, um, the whole world knows is one of the fullest examinations of a character in a time of personal and emotional crisis, and one of the best portraits of her small town, small city community. This is named Morgana in the short story. Rand, our main character, throughout is carrying on some kind of relation with a much younger woman. It almost seems like she's a teenager, but evidently that's not so. Towards the end, he takes her for a night of drinking in Pittsburgh, a beautifully told sequence, drinking on a barge, then diving into the night to the river's edge, then a little rental cabin. It's a true, it is, it, as is true throughout Wetley's fiction, the sex is quick, violent, cruel, and unsatisfying. And in this case, the characters flirt with suicide or homicide. The end is a bit unclear, but the fact that the story is a confession gives us some clues. Like all writers, Wetley is excellent at fathoming the consciousness of others. She's extremely observant of the details of life around her and has a very limited sphere, yet she knows the territory intimately. This story is one of her deepest explorations of mature or immature adult love. Her view of love is not comforting in any sense, but the characters and their struggle are real and poignant and full. So this brings us to the end of the 1940s and the beginning of the atomic age, the 1950s. On August 6, 1945, America became the first country to use a weapon capable of destroying everyone. Once those bombs were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the world changed and literature reflected that change. We as a society use literature to deal with fear that at any point, the world could end in a disaster. Hollywood reflected this fear in B science fiction movies with monsters and alien invasion. Literature saw, sorry about that, a return to conservatism, family oriented stories, and tales with a religious bent. So the Cold War, the space race, and civil rights. The 1950s brought about three important movements that changed America: the Cold War, the space race, and civil rights. This picture is from a famous comic book that kind of illustrates the intersectionality of all three. The Cold War involved in this virtual battle with the Soviet Union, in which both sides spent a great deal of money building arsenals and fighting proxy wars, but never fought each other. Eventually, the United States won, when Russia basically bankrupted it themselves. Part of this expenditure of the Cold War was the space race. Sputnik started it, but the United States quickly moves the action with JFK's call to reach the moon. Finally, civil rights and race equality becomes America's obsession. This picture from the comic book, which was criticized by a Senate subcommittee over the idea it was leading to juvenile delinquency. The producer of the comic, William Gaines, believed it was an excuse for racism. Our first short story is Sunny Blues by James Baldwin. This story mixes music with realism. We also get a clear view of what life was like for African Americans at this time. We see the role of religion, drugs, death, and music in their lives. All seem to mingle within Sunny's life story. This story really shows the realism of the post-war time. We see more literature dealing with stark realism. The story also shows a different side of the African American community. Baldwin paints a picture of a family touched by heroin and the scars it leaves. The brother finally understands and forgives each other. Brothers finally understand and forgive each other through music and the blues. Sonny finally finds his voice, and his brother sees the way music has given peace to Sonny. The next short story is The Conversion of the Jews by Philip Roth. Philip Roth took up one of the themes of the middle of the 20th century, religion. Roth was famous for his stories focusing on the Jewish community. He also discovers the godlike power, a Jewish community. In this story, a young boy is challenging his rabbi about God and religion. The young boy, also discovers the godlike power within himself by threatening suicide if everyone doesn't follow his instructions. Ironically, at the end, he does jump into the net, but only after getting his mother and the rabbi, along with all the people in the crowd, to promise to never hit anyone for questioning God. Finally, I have you watching a play. Well, not finally. I have you watching a play, The Long Day's Journey into Night by Eugene O'Neill. This work concerns the Tyrone family. It consists of the parents, James and Mary, and their sons, Edmund and Jamie. Mary is addicted to morphine, and Edmund is ill with tuberculosis. The long day refers to the setting of the play, which takes place during one day. The play is definitely semi-autobiographical. The play portrays a family in ferocious negative light as the parents and two sons express accusations, blame, and resentments, qualities which are often painted with pathetic and self-defeating attempts at affection, encouragement, tenderness, and yearning for things to be otherwise. The pain of this family is made worse by their depth of self-understanding and self-analysis, combined with a brutal honesty as they see it and the ability to boldly express themselves. The story deals with the mother's addiction to morphine, the family's addiction to whiskey, and the father's miserliness. The older brother's licentiousness, and the younger brother's illness. Finally, we look at some of our poetry. I have a nice copy of Harlem by Langston Hughes for you to listen to. It's read, as well as to read it and to read a little bit about Langston Hughes. Here's the poem. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? Hughes again seems to capture the pent-up frustration of the African American community as civil rights seems to constantly be put on the political back burner. The community was tired of waiting and being told to wait by privileged whites claiming to be political allies. Martin Luther King captures the same feeling in Letters from Birmingham Jail, where he actually says at one point he prefers the Ku Klux Klaner to the white Christian moderate because he knows what the Klaner ultimately wants, while a moderate expresses support, but only verbally. Finally, I have for you, Howl, and you're only reading part one of Howl by Allen Ginsberg. I made a mistake there. Howl is one of the most famous examples of beat poetry. The poem is meant to be spoken. In fact, it was first performed at Six Gallery in San Francisco in 1955. The poet was even charged with obscenity violation because of what is going on in the poem. The poem consists of 3 parts with additional footnotes. Part 1 is best known and is autobiographical, and that's the one you're going to focus on. It communicates scenes, characters, and situations encountered in the late 1940s and early 1950s through Ginsberg's personal experience, as well as a community of poets, artists, political radicals, jazz musicians, drug addicts, and psychiatric patients that Ginsberg meets. Ginsberg refers to these people as the quote, best minds of my generation. He describes their experience in graphic detail, openly discussing drug use and homosexual activity. So I have a nice version of that, including one that's being read for you. So I encourage you to listen to it. I also put a couple of articles about it. It really was a poem that is considered to have changed America in that it gave voice in a way that had never been done before. Though many people often consider it similar to some of Walt Whitman's material, it really was a different sound. And it really expressed things in a different way and really kind of gave homage and shed a light on some of the most isolated communities, such as psychiatric patients, homosexuals, drug addicts, the bohemian life, people that chose to be off the beaten path. All right, so that leaves us into the 1960s next week. Remember, you should be doing your papers, and that actually I believe is will be graded this week. I think it's due as I'm posting this, and keep up the good work.